This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
The Wolverines make history in Iowa City. Details next on this week's episode of Michigan Podcast.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deep for Anthony Carter. Waits for it. Hit. Caught.
They said you can't beat Ohio State. Now what?
Brady gets terrific. Throws it. And a touchdown. Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him. And a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris packs a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Sack. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again. Michigan.
Blue, greetings. Welcome to this week's edition of Michigan Podcast. I'm Steve Deace, and of course, we are sponsored by our good friends over at Prize Picks. What is Prize Picks? It's the easy way to play daily fantasy. You can download the app right now. The award-winning app, by the way, it's easy to use on your mobile, both available in the App Store and over at Google Play. And you can get going right now on Michigan and other teams all over the country with props on player production. Prize Picks is the best legal way to play player props in states like California, Florida, Texas, and of course, Michigan. When you download the Prize Picks app today, set up your account using promo code Michigan. You'll get an instant deposit match of up to $100 when you do. Again, download the Prize Picks app today and set up your account using promo code Michigan to get an instant deposit match up to $100 when you download the app from the App Store and or the Google Play Store. This week's Prize picks from me, and I'm 7-5 so far this season, are Michael Penix for Washington to go over 335.5 passing yards against a terrible Arizona State secondary, and former Northwestern star Isaiah Bowser, I think, is going to run all over SMU. I think Central Florida will, the way that Maryland did. I'm going to take Bowser over 70.5 rushing yards in that game, and so far this season on these, I'm 7-5. And now back to the Wolverines, and yes, you heard me right at the top. Michigan made history at Kinnick Stadium on Saturday. As Jim Harbaugh said last week, Kinnick Stadium is where, quote, top 5 teams go to die, and he wasn't exaggerating in the least. The last 6 top 5 teams to go to Kinnick Stadium since 2008, 5 of them lost. The only win, Penn State screwed up the clock at the end of the game when it could have kicked a field goal, had to throw the ball into the end zone and got a touchdown in the final play of the game. That was the last time a top 5 team, the only time since 2008, a top 5 team has won at Kinnick Stadium. Of course, one of those victims, you'll remember the number 2 ranked Michigan Wolverines back in 2016. So this is the place where top 5 teams go to die. Michigan not only did not go and bury itself, but it took over the game from the jump and was pretty much, with the exception of one stretch in the early fourth quarter, in complete control of this game the rest of the way, exerting their physical dominance, showing Iowa that, yes, we can play your style of play too. In fact, we kind of prefer it. We're just going to play it with better recruited players. And they physically dominated Iowa from really the jump. On the offensive side, they did. I thought we'd have to throw the ball more to get to run the ball like that. Nope. Was able to run like that from the very beginning. And then you saw the defensive line take over, especially the final possession of the game, and bury Iowa with the pressure. And so here's what this means. I went and looked it up. There has not been a top 5 team to win by double digits at Kinnick Stadium since number 1 Ohio State in 2006. That's 16 years ago. Michigan is only the second top 5 team to win by double digits at Kinnick Stadium this century. It does not happen very often. This team plays its style. The crowd gets on you, breaks you down, breaks your will, makes you panic, and then eventually makes you play its style as well. And I think that's maybe what Michigan did better than I anticipated. First road test of the year, first road start of his career for J.J. McCarthy. And you know it's in his DNA. He wants to play some hero ball. He wants to play, hey, you know what? Let's draw it up in the dirt, and my guys are better than your guys. But he stayed within himself, stayed within the system. And then when we needed him to draw it up in the dirt a little bit, that ended up being the game-clinching touchdown pass to Donovan Edwards there in the third quarter. So JJ played within himself. The offensive line fully healthy and together for the first time this year. The unit that was billed by Phil Steele, the best offensive line in the country, that a lot of us thought could be even better than the offensive line that won the Joe Moore Award last year, finally had all 5 of its pieces together in a game and definitely looked the part in the way that it ran the football against Iowa. That's only the third time in its last 30 games that Iowa has given up a rushing total anything close to that. You just don't run the football like that on Iowa, and we did. And then, of course, Blake Corum is quietly maybe putting together a bit of an understated Heisman campaign so far. One of the top-ranked rushers in the country. He's the leading scoring player in the country right now as well. So the Wolverines sit at 5-0 and have taken a major step to being at worst 10-1 heading into Columbus at the end of the year and passing a road test that in the past, with teams we thought were as good, if not better than this one, it was unable to pass at Kinnick Stadium. And so now you survive and advance. You move on this week against Indiana. What I think is key this week is we've got to put more on tape where the passing game is concerned. And I think this is the game where you can really exploit Indiana's weakness in the secondary, provided that the weather is good in mid-October in the Big Ten, and get some of those wide receivers that there's been some scuttlebutt, behind the scenes, internet rumor stuff. It's even come up in some press conferences that some of these guys are like, hey, coach, when's it our turn to eat? That should be this week. Blake Corum has carried the ball 60 times. You don't want to put another 25 on those tires, and you shouldn't have to against the Hoosiers. You still have Donovan Edwards coming back a bit. Was on a bit of a pitch count last week against Iowa. So let's find out what this fleet-footed group of receivers can do, and let's let JJ, open it up a little bit and see if we can't get some big plays in the passing game. Put those things on tape to make that running game even more devastating as the winds turn to the winds of November and the weather gets colder. And then that's the way you want to play in Columbus. It's really hard to go to Columbus and beat them at a track meet. That's the way they want to play. We're going to be the team that's going to want to drag them into the mosh pit come late November. We've shown we can do that. Now we need to show, though, that if you go ahead and stack the box, can we throw it over your head? And that's what we need to show, I think, this week against the Hoosiers. Let's find out what Mark Rogers thinks about that when we return. Time now for the 10-minute war. Let's bring in perhaps the world's only reasonable Buckeye fan. Also the voice of college football, at least that's what he calls himself on his outstanding YouTube channel. Mark Rogers is here with us again on Michigan Podcast. Good to have you back here with us, Mark. And Michigan gets out of Iowa City without getting kinnicked. I laid out some of the stats here at the top of the show. There has not been a top 5 team that has won at Kinnick by more than a touchdown since number 1 Ohio State in 2006. In fact, this is only the second top 5 team to win by double digits at Kinnick this century. Since 2008, top 5 teams were 1-5 at Kinnick Stadium. The lone win, you'll remember that was a Saturday night game when James Franklin screwed up the clock at the end. They could have kicked a field goal to win it, and they had to throw a touchdown in the last play, and Trace McSorley did, and they pulled that one out, right? And so that's the only time that a top 5 team has won at Kinnick Stadium in the last 15 years. So Michigan got it done, really with the exception of a few minutes early fourth quarter. They never really threatened. If anything, you could argue they should have led by more. But the key thing when you go play at Iowa is you can't let them force you into mistakes. You have to be patient. And that's what I didn't think Michigan was going to be able to do with a young quarterback, and yet they did. I actually thought it was a very impressive win, given the history there and the circumstances, but what say you?
Workmanlike. Michigan was very workmanlike, and I say that in a positive tone. That's a compliment to both the way J.J. McCarthy was handled and the way he was able to execute that direction. Game manager. He was a game manager on this day, and again, not as a slight or a negative, but as a positive, turned into game manager. The shot that he took to Andrell Anthony downfield for about 29 yards, I believe, was the one time that they really saw an opportunity to take what was there and take a shot. But other than that, there was a number of ISOs on the Iowa secondary because those are very savvy players like a Cooper DeJean trying to bait JJ, and him being able to avoid the big mistake. They also obviously took the opening kickoff, and this was highlighted a number of times, and I thought it was very just poignant to how good this program's become and this particular team. The offensive line is just really strong. That center from Virginia, Olawatimi, is an exceptional player. Mm-hmm. And it's not just the offensive line, and you think of it as the offensive line does their job, and then the running backs just look for the hole and run it where the hole is, or they look for the cutback lane, there it goes. No, but just the coordination between the two brings me to the coaching that must be taking place, that it's just not the offensive line does their job, running back take the ball, and you run through the hole, but it's even more orchestrated than that. That opening drive really illustrated the coordination of those two units being on the same page, and it was a thing of beauty. And it being at Kinnick was key to, okay, let's not let this be a 7-3 game late in the second quarter. Punch in the mouth, take the ball, move it down the field. Okay, now Iowa's in a hole at 7-0, and for the Iowa offense to be in a hole at 7-0 is more like 17-0 for everybody else.
Agreed. So at this point now, after this game against Indiana, then you have Penn State. That looks like that. Penn State's on a bye this week, so that looks like it'll be a top 10 matchup. Michigan's a 21-point favorite at the Hoosiers. I want to talk about that game for a few minutes because I think there are two things. I think there's a lot of Michigan fans, and maybe I was among them at first, who thought that JJ coming in meant that we were going to run the Ohio State system. And I think we have to, number one, remember who the head coach is here, and that he has actually found a way to use spread formations with tight ends as H-backs and fullbacks and lead blockers. He has found ways to use that to run the power game he loves without such a congested box, meaning that you still, even if we're barely going to throw to those guys, you can't just leave some guy wide open in the slot, right? You have to account for him in your run fit, so you can't load the box, like you could before. And you saw against Iowa, even without, they were without one of their guys, but that entire linebacker core was on the Butkus Award watch list to start the year. I mean, Campbell might have been the best linebacker returning in college football this year. And you saw with JJ, even if we don't want to run it with him because Cade's hurt, we don't have an experienced backup right now, the threat that we might on any down, just a snap second of hesitation by those linebackers that they can't come downhill on the snap and fill the gap. With the way our offensive line blocks, that helps that coordination that you're talking about. They get essentially an extra half second because you have to account for J.J. McCarthy. I assume, Mark, moving forward, And maybe it'll happen this week against Indiana because Tom Allen's a former defensive coordinator. So I thought Iowa would do it. They never did. I assume someone at some point is going to say, you know what? We're just coming downhill every snap. And if JJ keeps it and creases us and takes it to the house because he's a 4 or 5 guy, we'll have to live with that. But we'll just have to call your bluff because we can't sit here and let Blake Corum just get 5, 9, 12, 11, 7, 8 yards all day long. That's killing us. You're controlling the clock. You're controlling the game flow. We can't handle that. And I think one way to avoid that is showing more consistency in the passing game. Putting on tape that we are willing, if you do that, we are willing to punish you if you go man against us on the outside against those receivers. And I kind of think that this is the week for JJ to do that. What are your thoughts?
I love your first point because I was going to go in that direction as well. So unlike most of the people watching this that are watching from a sheer Michigan perspective, and I know that you are first and foremost, but being a college football guy, you're watching this from all angles. So I'm watching both teams. I'm just as invested in Iowa as I am in Michigan. And the stark contrast between what, from the standpoint of if you consider conservatism, pass run ratio, there's not a whole lot of difference between the two teams. But to watch where they get to the same point is exactly what you just outlined. The creativity in the formations, the motion, the number of players that handle the ball, all of that on the Michigan side versus Iowa was extraordinary.
Yeah.
And I know that Iowa's hamstrung to a certain extent. It's their fault. But by the personnel, they just don't have the weapons that Michigan does. So Michigan can choose out of
Have you ever seen a tight end H-back loop? Do a fake loop block like we did on that reverse to Ronnie. I've never seen that in my life. Maybe that's like what wing T stuff was in the 40s, okay? But in my era, I've just never seen that a blocking scheme like that. It was friggin' genius, man. I've never even seen it.
Yeah, so it's impressive. Sam Laporte is their best player. Mm-hmm. He's a tight end. That's just not a good place to be. But anyway, back to Michigan. Yeah, they're going to have opportunity to do. I think that they, and obviously the proof is in the result, approach this Iowa game the right way. They're going to have, opportunity, you would think, in this Indiana game to show us what they're trying to become. And it's the next step for JJ in his development. And yeah, I just think that it's an interesting game from that standpoint.
I wonder, and DiNardo talked about this in August during the BTN bus tour, looking at Michigan and Ohio State compared to every other team in the Big Ten, and that he really thought that they were building towards another 10-year war with the amount of talent that they each had in the pipelines, particularly even amongst their younger classes, how much more talented they were than the other teams in the Big Ten. Now, maybe Penn State with its last couple of recruiting classes maybe catches up to that maybe in a year. But the whole 10-year war thing, and the old stories that about Michigan would, practice for Ohio State in the spring, that Ohio State on game weeks would have full days of practice during games that weren't about the opponent on Saturday, but about Michigan. That basically was all preparation to lead to that crescendo. I wonder, if you go back to when Jimmy was at Stanford, right? The top two, after he dethroned USC, the top two programs in that conference during that mini run he had there were Stanford and Oregon. And they just had dramatically different DNAs in terms of schemes and approaches, right? I mean, Oregon with Chip Kelly was on the cutting edge of everything, and Stanford was old school. I wonder if in Jimmy's mind, that is the plan here. And he knows that we can't do that with a Wilton Spate or a John O'Corn and beat Ohio State. But we never planned on throwing the ball 40 times a game. We're going to play our game. But we needed a quarterback in there that if we had to throw it more to loosen you up and make you respect it, we could. But that actually we are better off zigging against your zag. You know what I'm trying to say? Instead of trying to recruit at the exact same level Ohio State does for the elite skill players, good luck with that, okay? Instead, we're going to be the team that forces them to change their system and to play in more of a mosh pit than they are accustomed to, and do what he did at Stanford so successfully against Oregon. What are your thoughts on that from a Buckeye fan perspective?
The first version of the 10-year war, they were mere images of each other. So it was whoever made the mistake whoever could muscle up a little bit more that day. But they were mirror images of each other, and then turned into, more modern football near the end of that when Earl Bruce took over and so forth. But yeah, the Oregon-Stanford, that is just when people make analogies to boxing, football, that's your boxing match, Oregon-Stanford.
The styles make fights kind of thing. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Oh, that was just exceptional that when those two were owning the Pac-12, because the end of the spectrum, trend-setting Chip Kelly that you just outlined, and everything that they would do with the light offensive line that would get out in space and everything, and then you would see basically a rugby match on the other side with Stanford, and their offensive line splits would be about that, and it was just phenomenal to watch the dichotomy there. Now we're not going to see. It's going to be more nuanced.
Yeah,
it's not going to be anything to.
I mean, even last year, this perception that we drug you guys into a blizzard and made you play 3 yards in a cloud of dust. There were 69 points scored in that game. All right, Ohio State still threw for for well over 300 yards. All right, so it's not going to look quite like Oregon and Stanford, right? But in terms of what the final score might look like, we're talking more stylistically that. Michigan, I think Jimmy has reached the conclusion that they probably can't consistently recruit at a level that they can beat Ohio State like that. And so we're going to be the most elite version of Wisconsin and Iowa that we can be with our recruiting chops, and then try to beat Ohio State stylistically by making them play in a phone booth. Don't you get the sense that maybe that's what he has settled on here?
I get the sense that every week you're pushing me closer to raising Michigan to Ohio State's level, and I just can't go there. I just can't.
I'm really not. I'm just talking about this particular. I'm just making an observation, man. It's not trying to make it like cosmic. I know Jimmy is big into history, right? Both in terms of history and the history of the game. He's always making historical analogies. I think he clearly has. I think he tried the speed and space. It was a disaster. Last year, Josh Gaddis, I kept telling everybody, wrong Michigan assistant won the Broyles Award. No one listened to me, right? Then Gaddis went down to Miami, and look what's happened since he's gone down there despite all that hype. What happened last year is Jimmy ran his offense. He just moved it into less congested formations. They just ran it out. They ran more split zone. They ran more duo instead of pro-style offenses, so you can't, blow up the box with players. And I think when he figured out, I can still run a lot of this stuff that Bo taught me how to do, but I can run it out of 21st century formations. I think that's kind of what I'm getting into. I think he had just made the decision that was Michigan's path to making it a rivalry again.
And what you're getting to is sizing up these two coaches, that they're never going to deviate from what their core beliefs are and who they are as offensive coaches, Ryan Day and Jim Harbaugh. So Ryan Day, he has toughened up his team because he saw it as a requirement. And they are a more hard-nosed, offensive line-oriented, run-the-ball, beat-you-up team. But they're not going to get away from what they truly are, and he's not going to recruit any differently than he has. And you're sizing it up with Harbaugh, that once the ball's in the playmaker's hands, it becomes the same offense than it was when he was running it.
Correct.
But everything looks completely different leading up to the snap of the ball and when it's placed in the ball carrier's hands.
Speaking of history, I saw Mayan Williams is the third Buckeye running back to get 5 touchdowns in a game. The other two, Pete Johnson and Keith Byers. And if you look at Mayan Williams, those 3 guys are like all built alike. Like there's no Ezekiel Elliott or Travion Henderson in any of those. Those are all old school. I think people were shocked in the mid 80s how big Keith Byers was to run the way that he did, right? We just didn't typically see that kind of stuff. And Pete Johnson, of course, got overshadowed by Archie Griffin back in the day. But I mean, Mayan Williams is kind of cut right out of that cloth in terms of the way he looks physically. And that kind of speaks to Ohio, what you talked about, which is Ohio State figuring out. Essentially, we just had the same conversation. I mean, I'm talking about, all right, this week against Indiana, let's let CJ Stroud this thing a little bit and put some of that on tape, okay? And you're over there talking about, all right, let's put Pete Johnson and Keith Byers in the game and get them 5 touchdown passes to show Michigan that we're not going to get punked around and make an excuse about the snow again, right? I mean, didn't we essentially just have the exact same conversation, which kind of reinforces my point that a lot of this is now becoming, again, like it was when we were kids, preparation for that final game at the end of the year?
It's fascinating, and Penn State's the best barometer of all this. Mm-hmm. How will Ohio State play against Penn State? How will Michigan play against Penn State? Because they're the one team that could match up. Mm-hmm. Iowa, credit them for all the good things that they do. And I don't know that Michigan's getting enough credit offensively. And I got to tell you, Steve, at 20-0, I checked out. I'm trying to watch everybody play at the same time. And that was my number one game.
20-0, I got nervous. Because I knew at some point, Kinnick was going to have a say in the outcome of this game, or at least I was pretty convinced of it. So when I got to 20-0, I'm like, all right, man, I've seen this one before. I got really.
So I checked back in at 20-7. Iowa's driving like 80 yards. They get it inside the 5. They call that ridiculous 4th and 2 play where they can't even hit the tight end on his feet. And, it was a debacle inside the 5. And then I was like, man, I was waiting for a dramatic finish that I was not expecting. I say all that to say I saw the positive Michigan offense in this game against Iowa. But I don't think it should be dismissed, because if that was Georgia, Alabama, Clemson defensively on the other side, then people would be applauding.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Iowa doesn't get that kind of credit, but there's no getting around from a production standpoint. Results, Iowa's just as effective as those other defenses, if not even more. So to put up scoring drives at the rate that Michigan did and to score 27 points is an accomplishment against that defense in that building.
They'd only given up 23 total all year. I think that's only the 3rd time in the last 30 games a team has had a rushing total like that against Iowa. So that speaks to what you were just talking about. All right, brother. Good to see you as always, and we'll do it again next week, okay?
Thanks, Steve.
You bet. This week's Twitter poll results, we asked you, in his 4 career starts thus far, J.J. McCarthy is averaging 204.5 yards passing per game. Do you think J.J. will have a 300-yard passing game this season? 83% of you said yes. 16% of you said no. I'm starting to think that 16% of you actually might be right. Or at least maybe you want him to be, for Michigan to have the kind of season we're hoping for. Let's get to the feedback of the week. And this wasn't feedback to our show, but I just had to show this. This is from a Twitter account, Swanky Wolverine. Look what it did with the Step Brothers poster from back in the day. Touchdown Brothers, or Touchdown Bros, with Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards for Step Brothers. That's phenomenal. Everybody I've shown that to has gotten a kick out of that. That is very well done. I love the maize and blue sweater vests. I mean, that's some good internet right there. That is some good internet right there. All right, that's going to do it for this week's episode of Michigan Podcast. We'll be back again next week after what is going to be likely a resounding win against Indiana. But then it gets real. Top 10 Penn State coming off a bye is the week after that. We'll have a full preview of that game and more right here on Michigan Podcast. Don't forget to like, rate, subscribe, 5-star review, share, whichever applies, however you watch, like here on YouTube, or listen, like over on iTunes and Stitcher. Help us to find more Michigan fans just like you. The show continues to grow. We appreciate that. Let's keep that momentum going. You can also follow us on Twitter in between episodes at Michigan Podcast on Twitter, at Michigan Podcast on Twitter. Until next week, I'm Steve Deace, and go Blue.